Possibility of you being the next federal treasurer in a shortened Labor government, can you explain the proposed changes to the franking credits that will affect people that are already retired and are already enjoying the benefit of franking credits in their income streams?
Thanks, John. I can. Firstly, we are the only country in the world that sends tax refund cheques to people who haven't paid tax. We're the only country in the world that does it. It costs $6 billion a year at the moment. It's going to grow to around $8 billion a year. That's more than we spend on public schools from the Commonwealth Government. It's 3 times what we spend on the Australian Federal Police. I have to tell you, we can't afford it anymore. It's sending tax refunds to people who haven't paid income tax. Now, what does that mean in the real world? Let's take an example. If you've got a nurse who's earning around $67,000, we charge that nurse around $13,000 a year tax, roughly. Fair enough, that's what we charge her. If you've got a retired shareholder who owns their shares in a self-managed super fund, who earns $67,000 in dividends, we don't charge any tax, fair enough. And then we send a tax cheque refund for around $27,000. $13,000 we take from the nurse, $27,000 to the retired shareholder through their self-managed super fund. Same income, different outcome. I have to tell you, it's not fair. And now I understand people who receive the cheques like the arrangement, and I understand that they want to argue for that arrangement. I completely respect that. I completely respect the people who've worked hard and saved hard and have managed to build up savings. But I have to tell you, we can no longer, in this argument about where we're investing money and whether we can afford more for schools or hospitals, whether we can afford to provide increased support for pensioners to go to the dentist, which was another big announcement on the weekend, or to ensure that Medicare supplies support for people who are going through the battle of their lives with cancer, all expensive things.
Can we just go back to our question? Are you actually going to lose money out of Labor's policy?
Yes, I would.
And do you have any idea how much?
It's probably around about $7,000 a year.
Okay.
The thing, can I make a comment?
Yes.
You quoted those numbers of a person with a self-managed super fund. I think you're forgetting that's at the top end of it. The average person is nowhere near those sort of numbers. And the other thing is, if that goes away, doesn't that increase their pension from the government? Well, look, because they won't be getting that income.
Even if you are receiving a smaller amount of franking credit refund, and you're not on the age pension, because remember, age pensioners are exempt. So we're not taking, that's means tested. So in effect, we're means testing the benefit. At the moment,
there seemed to be some confusion about that in the debate tonight, and I'll bring in Mitch Fifield on that question in a minute. But can you explain what was going on in that debate?
Well,
it's very confusing to a lot of people, but there seemed to be a suggestion that pensioners were affected.
No, Scott Morrison was deliberately confusing it in that debate, to be frank. All pensioners with individual shareholdings are exempt, and all pensioners with a self-managed super fund at the date of our announcement are exempt. And there are relatively a few pensioners with a self-managed super fund, and therefore the pensioner guarantee is very clear that we will not impact on pensioners, and that's how we means test it. At the moment, it is reverse means tested. The more shares you own, the bigger cheque we send you. The more shares you own, we send you bigger cheques. Now that is, with respect, welfare for the wealthy. When you get up into the big shareholdings and we're sending big cheques every year for income tax, they have not paid. Now, the rest of us, in the pay-as-you-go tax system, the average worker can claim deductions, a few deductions here and there. You might even, if you claim a lot of deductions, get your tax bill down to zero.
Let me just,
but you won't get a tax refund.
You've had a questioner here, he's sitting in front of us, and you said welfare for the wealthy. Does that define you?
It doesn't define me, but unfortunately my wife would agree totally with what you've said, in the respect that what you're doing is taking away the things that the Howard and Costello government put in and taking it back to the original Keating scheme. Is
exactly
that
right. That's exactly right, sir.
Age pensioners are exempt.
That's exactly right, sir.
Okay,
so just very briefly, Paul Keating...
No, but before you do that, I'll come back to you, but Mitch Fifield wants to jump in here, and there was a huge issue in the debate. In fact, News Limited were calling it a defining issue, but I must say a lot of us were rather confused.
Right. OK, well, I've got to make the headline point that this is a $57 billion tax hit on retirees, on people who have planned for their futures, who've worked hard. Chris says that pensioners are exempt from this. That's not correct. I think Labor announced their policy on the 28th of March last year, and Labor say therefore, anyone who had a self-managed super fund before that time who's a pensioner is fine. Well, if you were someone who was a pensioner before that date, who subsequently gets a self-managed super fund, or you're someone before that date who has a self-managed super fund who subsequently becomes a pensioner, you're hit. And the estimate is that there'll be 50,000 people over the next 10 years who are pensioners who will be hit by Labor's changes. So when Labor say that pensioners are exempt, it is not true.
OK, Mitch, I'm going to pause you there because you need to respond to that.
Well, I mean, very clearly...
50,000 people over the next 10 years.
Well, Mitch said it's an estimate. It's his estimate. It's his estimate. I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is we have announced this policy well in advance of election, more than 12 months ago. We've said all pensioners are exempt with individual shareholding. We've said, for integrity reasons, that if you have a self-managed super fund, you're exempt at this date. Otherwise, you'd find people trying to game the system. Been very, very clear about that. Now, to your question, sir, you are 100% correct. We are taking it back to the original design. When Paul Keating implemented franking credits, dividend imputation in 1987, he said you can get your tax bill down to zero, but then we won't provide refunds after that. John Howard in 2000 said, I can do better than that, and he provided tax refunds. Now, what is dividend imputation designed to do? To avoid double taxation. So the company pays tax, and then the individual shareholder does not pay tax again. With franking credit refunds, when we're refunding the tax paid by the company to the shareholder, that's not avoiding double taxation. That's avoiding any taxation. The company pays tax, and we refund every dollar to the shareholder if they're retired and don't pay income tax. So the net tax take for society, for our country, out of that profit that Qantas or BHP or Telstra or whoever make is exactly zero. That is zero taxation, not double taxation, not single taxation, zero taxation. That is not sustainable anymore.
OK.
And as Chris Bowen, I think now famously said, if you don't like the policy, don't vote Labor.
Well, I was making the point, it's a very important point, Mitch. I was making the point that we've outlined our policies, unlike you, who said no change to the pension and then threw 100,000 people off the pension and reduced the pension for 300,000 people. So I'm not going to take lectures from you with respect.
OK, let's hear if we can from our...
Just one quick...
very briefly, because I want to hear from our other panellists. Mitch?
Yeah, all I was doing was quoting what Chris himself said there.
And I was putting it in context, Mitch, about your promises.
Right. But it's also important to recognise, apart from those in self-managed super funds, there are 900,000 people who will be affected by this change, and on average, they'll be about $2,000 a year worse off. These are real individuals who've worked hard, who've planned on a certain basis, who are now going to be hit by this tax.
All right. Lenore, it's obviously a calculated risk, I suppose, but Labor has to find the money to pay for its promises, and this is one of the big ones.
Yep.
Is it a risk that's going to work?
Well, I mean, I think Chris Bowen's arguments on the equity grounds are compelling, but Labor did make a decision not to grandfather this policy for everybody. I assume precisely because they wanted to use the money straight away for other priorities. And I can also understand someone like John, who's planned for a retirement on the basis of one set of rules and then the rules change, being a bit miffed about that. So clearly Labor's made a cost-benefit analysis that the miffed retirees are less, are less important, or that's a less
fewer than the people who
consideration than what they can do with that amount of money. That's a political calculation. Probably, on balance, if you're just looking at it through a raw political lens rather than, justice for John.
It's got a good ring to it, though.
It's a valid calculation, but Labor could have made the decision to grandfather it, and then it wouldn't have been as controversial
Justice
a policy.
for John, but not apparently his wife, who seems to disagree with it.